Welcome back, friends. You're now listening to Ideas Podcast, innovative dialogues on educational approaches and scholarship, supported by Research Hub, Faculty of Education, Simon Fraser University, where we attend to the thought-provoking research journeys and lives of graduate students and scholars. Simon Fraser University respectfully acknowledges Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Coquitlam, Kekite, Kwatlan, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen peoples, on whose unceded traditional territories our three campuses reside. In this second part, we move from the foundations of embodied knowing into the tensions, disruptions, and possibilities that emerge when this work meets institutional realities. So the way you describe those early imaginative experiences as a little girl when you felt you were very small, that vividly speaks to a kind of knowing that precedes formal schooling. And that also reminds me how across traditions the body has long carried meaning. For instance, you might be familiar with ancient Greek art. So in ancient Greek art, figures are often depicted at different scales to signify character and social status, as if the body itself becomes a site of expression and knowledge. So building on this, I'm curious, your work also brings in art, movement, and storytelling in ways that aren't always typical in academic spaces. What tensions and discoveries arose during your research journey?
Thank you so much, Ruhan. I just really appreciate how I feel as though you were witnessing, important moments. And thank you for bringing up Greek art as well. I'm not overly familiar, so I really appreciate the reference. In terms of your question, that's a really rich question about the tensions and the discoveries that arose. I actually found the body to be rather inconvenient because the body leads in ways that the mind may not. Again, I'm referencing Dr. Snober. And because you don't always know where the body is leading you, embodied ways of inquiring really require you to sit with uncertainty and vulnerability because the research is constantly in formation. I've noticed in a lot of conventional academic approaches, you often begin with a clearly defined theoretical framework and a methodology and move towards more concretized conclusions at the end. My research differs from this. I had to practice patience and honoring what was arising in and through my body as I leaned into generative sorts of questions, memories, and insights that would ripen over time. I wasn't reaching. I had to be patient and allow for ripening. And then my methodology would shift. Things would shift. So there's like quite a malleability and a listening and attending to the process. And I'd say this kind of work is not for the faint of heart. It was often destabilizing, especially when I'm navigating multiple roles and expectations and deadlines as a mother, a wife, a daughter. And sometimes I'd get frustrated and be like, I can't deal with this. I have deadlines. So it was hard at times. And when I began bringing art, movement, and intergenerational storytelling into broader academic spaces, I didn't initially recognize that I was actually challenging dominant norms. It wasn't until I presented at my first conference, it was a symposium actually, where I integrated spoken word, dance, and my family's intergenerational stories that I began to see how my work was perceived. And the night before my presentation, I felt really anxious because I think I sensed, okay, what I'm offering is a bit different than normal. And I remember I lost my voice the night before. And I started to wonder what my body was telling me. And I was worried that people might not relate to what I was going to offer if I spoke from the specificity of my body and the specificity of Punjabi Sikh lived experiences. And so anyhow, the next day I presented, and after the presentation, and it was beautiful. When I dance, I just feel so powerful. And there was a beautiful energy in the room. And after the presentation, some participants thanked me. And many of them said, thank you for disrupting disciplinary boundaries. And I remember thinking, what? I'm disrupting? I'm a disruptor? I hadn't realized this because during my contemplative inquiry program, an arts based research program, holistic ways of knowing and expressing were so normalized and welcomed that I hadn't actually reflected on being a disruptor. And one thing I want to share at the end of the symposium, a Punjabi woman approached me. She was doing her graduate studies as well. And she had tears in her eyes. And she said to me, keep sharing your stories. We were standing in the hallway, and she told me that this was the very first time in her formal schooling that she'd encountered Punjabi Sikh lived experiences and traditions in academic work. And she thanked me for speaking about the treacherous 3-month voyage that my ancestors took from Punjab to Vancouver, for honoring my father, who was, worked in lumber mills and was also a truck driver, something that really deeply resonated with her because of her own family's history and stories. And in that moment, I remember my goosebumps told me I needed to center Punjabi Sikh experiences and knowledges in my research because we are rarely represented, and especially women's voices and bodies. So this was really a moment of tension, but also of elucidation, I'd say.
Thank you for your answer. It really speaks to the vulnerability of working outside prescribed, scripted frameworks, where uncertainty and openness become part of the process rather than something to resolve. The way you describe both the frustration and the generative possibilities, along with a moment of recognition in the symposium presentation and the feedback that you received, suggests that disruption itself can be a form of care and invitation. So with that in mind, there's a powerful thread across many wisdom traditions that love and pain are not separate, but intertwined. From your understanding, is it necessary to move through pain or struggle to arrive at a deeper sense of love or oneness? How does this idea live in your work?
Thank you. I'm not sure I'm ready to answer this question. I'm ruminating and lingering on what you just shared about disruption as care and as an invitation. That was so beautifully said. So I just want to pause and take that in for a second. So thank you for that. And then your question. Wow, this is also such a rich question. It's so delicious. I'm taking from Dr. Charles Scott, who always talks about delicious ideas. So, thank you for this delicious question about the connection between love and pain in wisdom traditions. And I've noticed this too, that many wisdom traditions hold an understanding that love and pain are enmeshed, they're interconnected. In my doctoral research, I explored this relationship through Sikh orientations, and these orientations are relational and non-dualistic. And before I share some of my views, I just want to humbly acknowledge that my perspective is one of many. The Punjabi Sikh community is not a monolith, and there are diverse interpretations of Sikhi. But for me, I found that I was particularly drawn to feminist and decolonizing Sikh perspectives. And through these perspectives, I came to understand that affective states like suffering and ease, in Punjabi, we say dukh and sukh, aren't framed as opposites or aren't framed, in any kind of oppositional way, but are deeply connected and in relation. I think it was Dr. Arvind Paul Mandare who said these are inevitable seasons of life. And there are other Sikh scholars like Kamala Nair and Jaswinder Sandhu who suggest that pain can paradoxically be medicinal because it can be a catalyst for change. Again, Dr. Arvind Paul Mandare, feminist Sikh scholar Nikki Gunender Kaur Singh, whose scholarship really shaped my work, wrote about how heeding one's pain, listening to our pain, can actually open up pathways to truth and truthful living and the truth that we are connected, interconnected. And I've been really reflecting on this in relation to Guru Nanak Ji's life. Guru Nanak Ji was the first of the 10 gurus in the Sikh faith. And Guru Nanak Ji lived in 15th century pre-colonial Punjab. And during this time, there was a lot of pain. There was deep social and religious divides, including really rigid caste hierarchies. And Guru Nanak Ji allowed himself to experience the pain of the separation and of these divides. He describes it as intense and visceral, like a visceral kind of pain. And he didn't turn away from it. He listened to his body and he listened to the pain bodies around him. And he understood that pain wasn't necessarily individual, but tied to something broader, tied to broader social conditions. And an individual intervention wasn't going to remedy this pain. And his pain, it pulsed with deep love for his relations and deep pain. So it was very much connected. But this pain became the ground or the foundation from which the Sikh philosophy, Sikhi, was born. Guru Nanak Ji then reimagined radical oneness and interconnectedness, what he named as Ek Onkar. And this became the sacred phrase and the crux of Sikhi. And you asked a really great question about, is pain necessary for arriving at love or oneness? And I don't know about this. Although Sikh traditions recognize the connection between pain and love and that it's not separate, I'm not sure that pain is required to access oneness and deeper levels of love. I'm thinking about Nikki Ganundar Kaur Singh's work and what she deems as essential, and that is to fully experience our connection to the world and our relations in and through our bodies and our senses, like Guru Nanak Ji did. So in Sikhi, aesthetics and ethics, spirituality and sensuality are inextricably intertwined. Consciousness isn't an abstract thing. It's grounded, it's cultivated in and through the body and grounded in everyday experiences on earth. And by experiencing our relations fully and experiencing the beauty in love, that when there is separation, that pain is informative, that pain is a teacher and it drives ethical action, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I'm very grateful for all the generous sharing. It opens up a really important nuance around relational and non-dual understandings, where pain and love are not positioned as opposites, but as deeply intertwined within lived experiences. I also appreciate your hesitation around whether pain is something one must necessarily pass through to arrive at love, and how that question remains open rather than resolved. The example you brought in from the 15th century Punjabi guru, sorry, I don't remember the name, further deepens this sense of pain as something relational rather than merely individual. I wonder, in educational settings, why do you believe that embodied approaches are important, and how do embodied ways of knowing look like in practice? How have students responded to encountering different ways of learning and being?
Such a great question. Again, Guru Nanak Ji is the guru, by the way, that you mentioned. Thank you so much. So, yes, I believe that embodied approaches in the classroom are essential, especially for disrupting long-standing mind-body dualisms and distinctions, like what I was referencing in my earlier schooling, where implicitly the body is deemed as lesser and the mind is seen as superior in learning. And in my research, many scholars have spoken about this and have pointed out how the body has been absent, misunderstood, and sidelined in education and research. Some of these scholars that come to mind are Bell Hooks, Celeste Nazelli Snober, Mary Beth Cancien, who else? Paula Rosehart, Leora Bressler. A lot of scholars have lamented the absence of the body or the relegation of it to being lesser. And I've been reflecting and have noticed how this shows up in very subtle, everyday ways as an educator, but also as a parent. And also reflecting on how I came to see the body as peripheral to learning during my own schooling. So there's there's just been a lot of deep reflection around this. And there's one example that I must say irritates me a little bit. And this is the common usage of the term brain breaks. So let's take a brain break. And the body is used as sort of a break from the seriousness of learning from the brain. And through these brain breaks, implicitly, I wonder like how students internalize it. I think they internalize that the body is something we use to take a break from the real work of the mind, rather than understanding that the body stores knowledge and intelligence as well, and can be part of the learning process. So, and even when the body is included, I've noticed how it's often framed through regulation and self-regulation, which is very important. And I really appreciate all of these approaches. But as I was looking at the etymology and the root of the word regulation, the root of it is control. So if students are encouraged to manage or control their bodies for the end goal of regulation, without first being curious about what their bodies are communicating or understanding that the body carries knowledge and intelligence itself, then I truly feel this is tragic. Students miss out on opportunities to understand their own senses, their sensorial signatures, who they are, and building trust in their own sensations and understanding, their own inner knowing. And I noticed this tension with my own children. When they were younger, through my master's program, I got a chime, because we would do mindfulness practice as part of the master's program in contemplative inquiry. And I'd apply this to my parenting. Night, we'd do sort of a mindful exercise where my young kids could tune into their thoughts and feelings and bodily sensations. And then we'd go over the highlights and lowlights of the day and some positive affirmations. And one day, my daughter came home from school and said that her teacher has the same chime, but uses the chime to get the students to listen up to the teacher rather than to listen in to themselves. And that sort of stayed with me. I thought, okay, when are we encouraging students to listen to their bodies and be curious versus focus on the end result of regulation, which again, I think regulation is very important, but I also feel like the framing is important. And additionally, I think the body is important because it serves as a bridge to cultural connection and ancestral wisdom. Indigenous scholarship really shaped my doctoral research. And I found that different Indigenous scholars, such as Gregory Cayete, Joanne Archibald, and Margaret Kovac, they speak about how the body plays an integral role in holistic learning. And even in terms of trauma-informed research, Gabor Mate, Resmaa Menakem, Peter Levine, we know that trauma lives in the body, and that embodied practices of listening and awareness are important for healing. So if we're in the earliest stages of formative years, if we're not helping students or guiding them to listen to their bodies and really to build that capacity over the years, I believe we're limiting their access to healing, to wholeness, to understanding their identities and their ability to connect to cultural and ancestral connection. So I've deliberately integrated embodied approaches into secondary and post-secondary classrooms, and have had the wonderful opportunity of working with faculty associates in exploring how embodied approaches enlarge relational, cultural, and critical consciousness. I often use grounding practices or just in tuning to our sensations as we learn new concepts. I integrate what I call sensorial snapshots. So they're like stories, but sort of written from the body to emphasize embodied sensation. In the classroom, I've encouraged students to literally walk in the shoes of characters. And in the classroom, I often include an option of representing knowledge through movement and expression. And I've noticed this, especially for some neurodivergent learners, I'm neurodivergent myself, movement is so important. It's like breath for a lot of students. And when I was teaching high school, at the beginning of class, we'd have a mindful moment to ground our bodies, minds, hearts, and spirits, and I'd provide invitational prompts. And the rate of students being late to my class decreased. And when I asked them, they said, it's the only time in my day where I can chill, Miss Glover. And I've also noticed that embodied approaches really deepen self reflexivity. The tone of the class shifts when we're breathing together, when we share how concepts are landing in our bodies. Students, sometimes it takes some time. It's not because students don't always feel connected to their bodies. There's a bit of a learning curve, but over time students become more invested in authenticity and vulnerability and become less worried about getting that one particular answer right. It's like we're all part of the journey of learning. And I just finished teaching my very first undergraduate course in education in multicultural counseling at SFU. It was so wonderful, and I miss my students so much already. And many of my students commented on how embodied ways of knowing not only led to deeper capacities for reflection, but to a sense of community they hadn't experienced before. And some of them said decolonization had been abstract, but now they were feeling like it felt experiential and they understood decolonization in a grounded way. And it was so, I can't describe to you how beautiful it was for me to witness how students met each other through a tone and an ethos of humility and deep care. And it absolutely fills my heart with such joy and hope that these students will be going into the helping professions. So I would say embodied ways of knowing and learning and inquiring are so important because they're generative, dynamic, relational, conducive to building community, and allow for what Ted Aoki calls a lived and living curriculum that holds the capacity to engage and include all learners in deeply meaningful ways.
I'm very happy for your students who have experienced the genuine pleasure of your embodied practices in classroom. At the same time, what you just shared has highlighted a tension in how the body is often treated in schooling, sometimes reduced to a tool for cognitive efficiency, like you mentioned, rather than recognized as a form of intelligence in itself. The example of brain breaks and the students' reflections on how mindfulness is sometimes taken up as a form of behavioral regulation from your kid's example really brings this into focus. I'm also thinking about your own practice of embodied approaches where you and your students are invited to land in the body and how this can sometimes feel unfamiliar or even uncomfortable for students at first. I can visualize the kind of shock of first experience with embodied practices. Students are not always at ease with that kind of presence. So in that case, in seeking to contribute to the decolonization of education, research, and healthcare, in what ways do you hope future teachers, healthcare practitioners, and researchers adopt embodied and culturally anchored approaches?
Thank you. And you are so right. It is unfamiliar and uncomfortable in the beginning for some students. Some students, like for me, embodied approaches just because I had been exposed to embodied approaches throughout my life within Punjabi Sikh traditions and practices, it felt immediately comfortable to me. I'd rather dance than actually speak to express my ideas. But you know what I notice is a good way to start? Just with the breath, noticing the breath and really scaffolding after that and normalizing discomfort. Discomfort is such a rich pedagogical space. But anyhow, I'm going to answer your question because I could go on. Thank you for your question, if I've got this right, about decolonization and decolonizing education, research, and healthcare, which I speak about in the conclusion of my dissertation. Before I talk about decolonization, I just want to acknowledge the Indigenous Maori scholar Linda Tuhiwai Smith, who really awakened me to how knowledge and research is not neutral or universal or ahistorical, but embedded in colonial structures that continue to shape what counts as knowledge. And looking back, I can see how unlearning colonialism for me was necessary for me to then later reimagine and reclaim Punjabi Sikh knowledges in my research. I had to unlearn to create space for reclamation. And another scholar, Kakali Bhattacharya, in her decolonizing Pardesi framework, was really informative and inspiring. Through this framework, she centers South Asian lived realities and contemplative traditions. And her framework really invited me to reflect on the colonial violence within my own family in prioritizing intergenerational healing. But it also encouraged me to, she uses the words dream bigger in some of her publications, in encouraging scholars to really dream bigger in the ways of our ancestors and their contemplative traditions. And so I started to dream bigger. And I had planned on doing a dissertation by publication, but I realized the format didn't really align with Punjabi Sikh traditions. So then I conceptualized a different format of a dissertation, what I called a dissertation by pulsation, to foreground Punjabi Sikh notions of embodiment, relationality, fluidity, and ethicality. And this was also very much shaped by Indigenous scholars who have already given voice to relational and holistic ways of being and honoring our ancestors. I was really grateful to have my scholarship be inspired and shaped by many Indigenous scholars. And this also inspired me to then embed and practice a Sikh ethos of Punjabi Sikh ethos of respect and honesty and humility and love in my dissertation. So I even in the beginning talked about citations as embraces for those who have impacted my journey. Just these subtle sort of reframings, is that even a word, to foreground Punjabi Sikh orientations. And instead of fitting cultural perspectives into pre-existing Western methodologies, I proposed a Sikh research sensibility rooted in Guru Nanak Ji's teachings of Suniye, Maniye, and Manu Kita Pao, which Nikki Ganundar Kaur Singh translates as hearing and listening, embracing and remembering, and transformative loving. And I'm speaking about this in such a clear way, but I also want you to know that I experienced a lot of imposter syndrome about this. Who am I to propose this? You know, it feels so big, and I won't get into that journey, but I was so grateful to meet with an elder in our community who is now a senator, Senator Baltesh Singh Dhillonji, who I met with and spoke about, you know, Sikhi, and asked him a lot of questions and said, who am I to do this work and to represent this aspect of the work? And so I really appreciated his guidance and encouragement. So through this new format, my hope is that future scholars in arts-based research and embodiment, community engaged research, and or decolonizing approaches may employ a dissertation by pulsation in their own ways, or add to it, or feel emboldened like I did to center their own bodies and cultural bodies of knowledge and ancestral knowledge. And in education, as I mentioned, the body can act as a bridge, like connective tissues, helping students connect to their own lineage, their own identities, ancestry, cultural knowledges, and to their own inner voice and sense of authenticity. As an educator, I've noticed that learning is, as I've mentioned, is so much more meaningful when students are provided with opportunities to locate themselves through the curriculum rather than learn about a curriculum that's out there. And in the Sikh tradition, knowledge is not merely an intellectual pursuit. If we are learning through our minds alone, according to the Sikh traditions, this is where our egos can dominate and make our thinking more rigid. And when the body leads learning, there's so many more opportunities that emerge through the heart mind, body, and spirit. In healthcare, mind body dualisms continue to be really deeply entrenched, and these mind body dualisms contribute to inequity in healthcare. Arvind Palmander mentioned that Sikh and South Asian patients often disengage or prematurely terminate their sessions of Western counseling when the focus is on talking therapies and cognitive modalities. Again, the Punjabi Sikh diaspora is very diverse. And for some, cognitive therapies are great, but there is also, a portion of the diaspora who prefer embodied and holistic approaches because that is very much embedded in Punjabi Sikh traditions. So, from my personal experience, and as someone who's navigated chronic health issues, what I've noticed most in healthcare institutions when I'm told that culturally responsive approaches are integrated, it's usually surrounding language translation rather than understanding and integrating cultural orientations or cultural ontologies and epistemologies. And also, I've noticed that Western models tend to treat illness as an individual pathology that needs an individual intervention when Punjabi Sikh traditions are really grounded in relationality and community. As I mentioned, Guru Nanak Ji reminds us that pain can reflect broader social dis-ease and structures of oppression. So healing's not necessarily individual, but tied to collective healing and collective transformation and liberation. So I really hope that my research contributes to culturally responsive pathways in research, education, and healthcare, even if this means catalyzing important conversations or researchers just being in dialogue with the ideas I've proposed. And that would fill my heart with such joy just to further the conversation and further the dialogue as we think about more inclusive and holistic practices.
You can't imagine how grateful I am for your generous and delicious input. Now we're embracing Charles again by citing him.
I love it.
Thank you, Charles. It brings together so many resonant threads, breath as an entry point into awareness, discomfort as a pedagogical space rather than something to avoid, and the idea that learning can emerge from staying with what is unsettled. I'm also moved by how you speak about unlearning colonial inheritances, not only in institutions, but in family and everyday relational life. And this is a way of making space for something more attentive and alive. The idea of pulsation as a language you've created feels like a way of naming that ongoing movement between remembering, unlearning, and becoming. I'm also struck by how your work is shaped through relations of gratitude and humility toward Indigenous scholars, toward Sikh traditions of hearing, learning, and remembrance. I think there's one more. Could you please remind me?
Yes, so it's hearing and listening, embracing and remembering, and transformative loving.
Thank you. And toward elders who continue to guide and affirm your path. There's a sense here of scholarship as something deeply relational and embodied rather than isolated or purely conceptual. As we come to a close, I'm left with a sense of how your work invites education, research, and care practices to be re-anchored in breath, relation, and attentiveness to lived experiences. Thank you so much for sharing your journey and reflections so generously, Sandeep.
Thank you so much. How do you do this? You listen, you witness, you hold space, but you summarize in such a gifted way. And I'm reminded that these spaces can be spaces of healing when we witness one another. This is how I'm feeling in my body. My heart is full. I feel like we've been on a journey just now, a journey across time. And I also want to say, given that there are shared themes in our research, I am so excited for your doctoral journey and to read your research. And I just want to thank you for your generosity in you read so many of my pieces. You were at my defense and we met. And I know your intention is to be relational, but you fully embody and practice it. So I can't think of a better podcast host. I just want to thank you so much for your incredible, beautiful, heartfelt work and for inviting me into this space. And I really do hope we keep in touch. And I'm looking forward to more rich conversations with you. And all the best with your doctoral research.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. That is so kind of you of saying those. It means a lot for me. I do feel that this conversation was alive along this way, and I'm sure once it goes truly live online, it's going to stay there. And every time we listen to it, we will recall this moment.
So beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to end with the greeting, and it's also a parting in Punjabi.
Sure, please do. That's beautiful.
Sat Sri Akal Ji. Thank you. Thank you, Ruhan.
Thank you, Sandeep. Dear listeners, I hope you have enjoyed this episode as much as I did. If you're interested to explore more about Sandeep's research, we will post it with her bio, so please check it out in our website. Stay tuned. We'll be back next month. As we come to the end of this conversation, we leave with a deepened sense of what it means to live this work within, alongside, and sometimes against the spaces we inhabit. What lingers for us is not only the ideas shared, but the way of being they gesture toward, attentive, relational, and quietly transformative. Thank you for joining us in this dialogue. We hope it stays with you in your own reflections, conversations, and practices.